When you're working on a mix, it's really easy to get stuck chasing sounds. You keep tweaking, adding plugins, trying different ideas, and it always takes way longer than it should to actually land on something that feels right. That's exactly why I built my plugin company, Carb Audio. We create plugins that help you get the sound that you're hearing in your head much, much faster, and without all of the extra steps that typically come along in the process. We've got the Smashburger compressor, which gives you punch, control, and character all in one place, so you're not having to stack multiple plugins just to shape a sound. We also have Busboy, which helps you dial in your buses quickly with EQ, compression, and limiting, so your mix starts to feel finished way faster. Then we have Slapshot, which gives you space and width, but without the mud and harshness that you typically have to fight using tools like delay and reverb. And then lastly, we have the Gascan amp, which lets you instantly tap into raw, gritty, blown-out tones that sound great on guitars, drums, keys, and vocals. Each plugin is built to help you move faster, stay more focused, and actually enjoy the process instead of getting stuck in it. Now you can grab them all individually, or get everything with the all-in bundle at the best value. And if you already own any of our plugins, just log into your account, add the bundle to your cart, and you're gonna see a personal upgrade discount automatically applied. So if you want to stop chasing sounds and start landing on them much faster, make sure to check out the Carb Audio plugins at carbaudio.com. And if you want to try any of them first, every plugin has a 14-day free trial too. So once again, that's carbaudio.com. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me. Today is a special episode. We are at episode 300, which is absolutely crazy to me. The fact that you could basically listen to an episode a day for almost an entire year blows my mind. Like when we started this podcast 8 years ago, I think it was, I really had no idea that it would be this big of a project and that we'd be continuously doing interviews. And I just want to say thank you. If you're a listener if you've been following for a long time, you're a regular listener, just thank you. And if you're new, thanks for listening. This podcast, really my goal with this right from the beginning was to shed a light on the processes that professionals are doing, and so that can be transferred to the home studio so that you could understand what to be listening for, knowing different techniques, and how to get the pro results that you want from your home studio. And so, I'm just really thrilled to be able to say that we've gone through 300 episodes and have chatted with so many people in this industry. And even that itself too, like I think it's a really good testament to the type of people that are in this industry. We've had so many amazing guests and some people that I thought would be like unobtainable to reach out to. But time and time again, people are always so open to sharing their knowledge with us and coming on. And it just really makes me excited and proud of our community. And I just think that we have so many amazing people in our community who have been on the show already and that will be on this show. We're inspiring the next generation of engineers, and there's still a ton of other amazing, great engineers that we have to have on the podcast too. But yeah, the fact that we're 300 episodes is absolutely wild. So again, thank you as a listener for listening and following along and, getting involved in Master Your Mix and our courses and coaching and the Carb Audio side of things with the plugins as well. It really means a lot to me. And I do want to give a special shout out especially to my assistant, Reed, who he has been editing this podcast for the last 5 or so years. Unfortunately, he has just announced that he's going to be leaving. So I think this is going to be his last episode, which kind of makes it even more special to some degree. But yeah, we've had a lot of people working on this podcast over the years and just really grateful for that. So yeah, again, thank you to everyone who listens, who's been part of this journey, who's helped introduce someone to the podcast, helped bring on guests, all that kind of stuff. It means the world to me. So thank you again. I really appreciate it. Now, with today's episode, I was thinking, do we do something really special or whatever? And honestly, the thing that to me lights me up with this podcast is helping people. And so I didn't want to do a greatest hits thing or, some weird episode that is just out of place. So we're going to keep the train rolling with interviews. And today's episode is with a producer, an engineer, and studio owner. His name is Dave Trumfio, and he's based out of Los Angeles these days. He's originally from Chicago. He has his primary studio, which is called Kingsize Sound Studio, but he also owns more than 40 other studio rooms across Los Angeles. And he's sort of become this studio landlord that is providing amazing rooms for engineers and producers out of the Los Angeles area. And today's episode I thought was actually a great episode to have as episode 300, because in this episode, we focus a lot on the state of recording studios and big studios, medium-sized studios, home studios, the future of music and how people are creating music. I think this is a really important conversation to have, whether you're someone who is getting into buying studio equipment for the sake of just recording your own music for fun, or maybe you're someone who has started dabbling in this and knows it a little bit and feels confident enough to start recording bands, or maybe you want to have your own studio. Regardless, it's really important to be aware of the investments that you're putting into this process and into the tools and understanding how to get the most return out of them. And not just from a monetary perspective, but also knowing how to get the most out of your career, understanding where you need to take your music, what you need to do beyond just the audio side of things in order to have success in this industry. And in this episode, we definitely cover all of that. And Dave really gets into all of the evolutions of his studio, his process from starting from one studio to building out to eventually over 40 different studios, what that looks like. We also talk about how he has actually made some major decisions as far as gear and has downsized from having some legendary equipment for the sake of future-proofing his studio. And we talk about how to future-proof your own studio as well. And Dave offers a lot of really positive advice here that I think is very encouraging for anyone who is getting into being a studio owner or getting into the process of music production. So if you want to survive in this industry as a studio owner, as a musician, doing your own thing from home, this is going to be a really helpful episode. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. David Trumfio, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. How's it going today?
Going great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. For people who might not be familiar with you, can you give us a little background on who you are, what you do, and how you got into all the cool stuff you're working on these days?
Yeah, great. I guess I'm a music lifer, I guess, at this point. I've been doing it as long as I can remember. I was a little kid wanting to be a musician and play guitar and start a band. And basically, somewhere around 9 or 10, got into all that rigmarole and have never stopped, really. The recording side of things kind of developed much like why I'm a bass player and wanted to be a guitar player, is because I wanted to have a band and I wanted the band more than I wanted to choose my instrument. So we needed a bass player. So I played bass. Then we needed to we started recording, we started playing, and I'm like, be really cool to hear what we sound like. And, starting with my trusty little kind of grammar school cassette deck thing, started recording our jam sessions, and that kind of spun into a lifelong career of audio.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So as far as learning the production side of things, did you ever have any sort of training, or was it all self-taught and just kind of figured out as you go?
It was, this is going back, I'm old. I'm in my late 50s now. So this is back in the late 70s, early 80s. So there weren't YouTube videos and stuff, there wasn't even recording schools at that time. So I actually bought this book by Craig Anderton. He was a well-known and still is a well-known music writer. And he had a book called Electronic Projects for Musicians and Home Recording for Musicians. And I ended up getting that book somewhere around junior high age and just devoured it. And, it's pretty funny because he had your DIY, acoustic treatments with milk, with egg crates and stuff like that. These cardboard, on the walls. And, it's back when rehearsal rooms were all carpeted and just, make it dead, make it dead. It's very 70s, make it dead kind of approach, kill all early reflections kind of approach. And, but anyways, I started there. And, eventually got a 4-track Fostex X15 right around when they came out in the early 80s. And it's pretty funny that the ad for the Fostex X15 was, the Beatles used the 4-track, so can you. Why you can make a masterpiece like the Beatles. Me not realizing, those were awesome custom tape machines or Ampex 4-tracks and stuff.
That's a good marketing guy on that team. Yeah.
Yeah, no. So it was 12, 13-year-old self was like, whoa, I can make a Beatles record. Awesome. So it all started there. And then, somewhere around the line, I kind of learned the pro stuff the old fashioned way. I after high school, I was enrolled at Columbia College. And even then, it was pretty early days for recording schools. So the real way that you learned was you got an internship and you kind of apprenticed. So I apprenticed at a place called Sea Grape Recording here I'm in Los Angeles now. Then I was in Chicago, and I was like getting really into drum machines and electronic music. And my teacher at Columbia College was like, hey, these guys are like recording, this new music called house music. And so they were pretty early on the Chicago house scene. But they also recorded metal bands and all, like kind of country rock bands and stuff. So I kind of really learned my pro kind of chops apprenticing for the guys at Sea Grape. It's Mike and Tom.
Nice.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you said that you got started with this idea of wanting to listen back and hear your own band.
Yeah.
And then at what point did it start to become an idea that maybe this was like a potential career for you to have, aside from being the musician yourself?
Well, I make these recordings and then I'd play them, or we make cassette releases and people would hear it. And then other bands and other musicians would be like, whoa, like, how did you record this? And this is going back in the early 80s now. And it was, going into getting a real recording was pretty hard. You have to go to a real studio and spend some serious money and budget. And I kind of finagled my way to get like pretty good sounding recordings on the DIY tip, so other bands just started going, hey, well, can we record with you? Like, we heard you have an 8-track, because by the time I was like middle of high school, I got a Fostex 8-track and then eventually a Fostex half-inch 16-track. And so I kind of just started building my own career as like a recordist for other people, just off of my demos and my own recordings that I was doing and people hearing them.
Very cool. Well, that actually kind of ties into one of the questions I was curious to ask about, which was that when I was doing some research on you, like one of the big themes that kept coming up was this concept of like studio ownership and the idea of having a good room to work out of while still making money as a producer. And I've even heard you talk about like the debate of, working in big studios versus smaller producer rooms, and, thinking about it from the perspective of profitability and, actually being able to make a career out of this. So yeah. I'm curious to know, like, as someone today who is both a studio owner and a producer, like, what's your take on what makes the most sense these days?
I think pretty early on, I realized, okay, I need to have a job. And I was doing it and people were starting to pay me to do this stuff. And then as a producer, as I kind of started getting some like, bigger projects and stuff and working with some smaller indie labels, I was realizing, like, budgets, if you go into the big studio, like, as the producer, as the engineer, you'll create your fee for that. You're kind of restricted. If you know the studio really well, like I knew Sea Grape, so I would do sessions there early on. But I also had my home studio, and I found as a producer, and if I was like really developing an artist, maybe I was like, I approached an artist and said, hey, I really like your music. I want to work together. And they're like, well, we don't have a deal or a budget. So I would, having my own space was super important. And so I always kind of had my own room. I always had my own studio. And as I kind of developed my career, I realized, when budgets got a little bigger and a little fancier, here and there, I would go to the proper tracking studio, but I pretty quickly started my own kind of tracking room. That would have been late 80s, early 90s. And I've always had my own room. So that kind of became really important to making a living because I would be able to take the full budget. So instead of having to pay another studio, I would, like a decent indie budget back then would have been like maybe $25,000. And to do like the whole record, and this is like before everybody had a home studio and everybody could do it. I would camp out with a band for 6, 7, 8 weeks. And knowing that I had my own spot and I was kind of doing it all in-house, I would be able to take what they would call the recording fund and I'd be able to make the record. And, it wasn't the kind of case like, well, we went 10 weeks, so I need a little more money. No, it was my responsibility as the producer to take that 25, 20, sometimes 10, sometimes 12,000. We'd always figure out what the budget is, but we go, okay, this is what the budget is. And this is kind of like the plan. As the producer, I would lay out like the first 3 days, we're going to track basics. And then, but we would go through the whole process, and it would be all in the same room. We do pre-production, we track, we do overdubs, we do mixing, and in some cases, it's how I kind of got into mastering. And my partners at the time in Chicago, we all kind of started a mastering room because we realized we can do this too. So
that makes sense.
Yeah. And, it was like the dawn of Pro Tools. We were really early on Pro Tools, like 95, we had a full Pro Tools rig. And, so we were one of the first people in Chicago to have an L1. So, we would,
nice.
Whether it was good or bad, we were able to make really loud records, and word got out like, these guys can make your record really loud, So, we learned that it was pretty crappy if you went too far. So,
of course.
Yeah. So I don't know. I guess I'm rambling here, but having my own studio kind of has always been my thing. And I kind of stumbled upon it. And now it's the norm. Now it's the model, right? So everybody has their own studios. Everybody, producers are expected to kind of, you hire a producer, and it's like you hire a plumber, for example, you get the plumbing truck and the tools, So you hire a producer, you get kind of what comes with all that. You get the studio, you get the engineering, you get, it's that kind of concept, which, Steve Albini had the same kind of flow. Maybe it's a Chicago thing, but a lot of my peers in Chicago in the 90s, like Brad Wood and John McIntyre and Steve Albini, a lot of kind of the indie rock kind of staples of that time in Chicago, we all had our own rooms that we could kind of play with the pricing and, be able to wheel and deal. We weren't dealing with a third party.
If you're a fan of the Master Your Mix podcast, you might not even know yet that we actually have a full website packed with a ton of resources designed to help you make better mixes. So head on over to MasterYourMix.com, and on there you're going to find free downloads, cheat sheets, blog articles, books, courses, and a whole bunch more, all designed to help simplify your mixing process, give you more clarity, and help you finish more music without second-guessing every move. And then, if you're looking for more personalized one-on-one help, where I can work directly with you on your tracks and walk you through the recording, editing, and mixing processes step by step, that's exactly what I work on inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. And you can learn more about that at masteryourmix.com/amplitude. And on that page, you can book a free call with me where we can talk through your current process, figure out where your gaps are, and identify the fastest ways to help you move forward with your tracks. And then if it makes sense to work together beyond that call, we can absolutely talk about that too. So once again, that's masteryourmix.com. And then for coaching, masteryourmix.com/amplitude. For sure. Yeah, that's very cool. I agree. I think it makes a lot of sense if you're someone who's going to be doing this regularly to invest in yourself and have the pieces. And, sometimes, there's obviously an upfront cost to starting a studio as well, right? So, you have to be smart with your money and not just have if you build it, they will come mentality sometimes, right? Because I think there's
a lot of that.
The marketing side. Yeah, there's the marketing side of it too that a lot of people completely forget about, right? It's like they're so focused on like, I know how to record people, I'm good at that, that's what I'm gonna do. And then when you own a place, you're like, oh shit, well, how do I get clients? How do I like manage my money and all that kind of stuff, right? So
that's
there's definitely more to it.
The chicken or the egg, right? So in my case, I was kind of like, it was early on, and I was, not most producers had their own rooms and stuff, so it kind of helped me get gigs for sure, being able to wheel and deal and stuff, and I feel like I've been doing this professionally. I guess you could say I was doing it professionally when I was in my mom and dad's basement charging for 8-track recordings. I was charging $150 a day, come in and record until my parents.
You were making money. I'd say you were a professional at that point.
Yeah. So that would have been like later high school kind of time. Yeah, my parents kicked me out after the drummer came up in underwear with pierced nipples, and they're like, "Oh, Dave, you're making money. I think you got to move." They at least let me turn 18 or 19. But anyways, yeah, I feel like in this industry, it kind of changes music, like the recording side of it and like what's trendy and what things are working. And it kind of changes every 5 to 7 years. There's a flow. And I've been through a bunch of these changes now. And one was kind of moving to where producers had their own rooms. And I was kind of noticing this in the kind of early 2000s, like by about 2005, I was kind of like noticing guys that would come in for like 4 to 6 weeks, producers, people who would be like doing the projects and kind of the nuts and bolts, the engineers and the producers, they would not come in as long. They would come in for a week or 2 weeks. And I'd be like, oh, okay, what were you doing overdubs? Were you doing mixing? Well, I converted my garage, or I have an extra room in my house now. So that was starting, the whole kind of modern model was starting around 2005. And so I kind of quickly realized, well, some of these guys, like, after talking to them, they were like, well, I'm in the extra bedroom and I can kind of do it. And, we just had a baby. And, so like they were looking for more professional kind of spots to do it. So I kind of quickly kind of adapted my kind of studio business side of things and took over a building that was next to my studio, Kingsize, and built these producer rooms. We built 5 producer rooms in there and, started kind of basically renting out like editing, mixing, overdub rooms. And so like that was like one of those kind of transitional, like 5-year, 7-year kind of things on up to modern day, where now a lot of people have their own rooms. And a lot of them are in a residential situation, so they can't do certain things. So I feel like it's kind of gotten to the point where, okay, so you're a producer and you're doing a lot of stuff at your home-based room, and then let's say you're like a pop producer, like a beat maker, let's say, and you have a chance to work with kind of an A-list top liner. And, you're talking with their management or their label and you're like, oh, okay, like we're going to do like a proper vocal session now. And, being able to, with like, for example, the place I opened, now it's going on 10 years now, but it's called Gold Diggers Sound in Hollywood. And we built 7 producer style rooms that we run day to day. And they range in size from like kind of like your standard, kind of like what this room is a control room with an ISO booth, on up to a soundstage, a proper tracking kind of studio. But one of the things we focus on are providing, like a day room, kind of a day rate for producers who need to host sessions, and so that's where I feel like the commercial side of things, like obviously the big tracking room is a big tracking room with Neves and APIs and lots of mics and a big room. I mean, most people don't have, a 50-foot by 25-foot room in their house, so, but especially like these like small production rooms, I realize like people kind of need professional spaces every so often to host sessions, whether it's doing a vocal session and having a Sony, 800, which is, a very expensive mic for most people, and they need the 1073 and the CL1B and, certain chains that are kind of industry standards now, so we have these rooms that we offer at very affordable rates to host these sessions for producers who are home-based producers that, 90% of the stuff they do, they can do there. But when the management or the label, they want to kind of host it in a professional environment. So that's something I've kind of realized that was the last 5-year kind of thing. What does the industry need? What do we need? What do people need? So I'm always kind of in the studio business side looking for what people need. I'm not stuck in like one model. I'm always changing the model.
That's really very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's very cool. Yeah. Cause like, it's hard enough to start one studio, but now, if I'm not mistaken, you're managing something like 40 different rooms.
Yeah.
And, that that has to be a lot to get started with. I mean, obviously you didn't start with 40, you started smaller and built
Started
from
with
there.
5. Started with 5.
Yeah. But still, I mean, five's a pretty big jump from 1, right? Especially
it would
when
have been
like,
6, it would have been 6, including Studio A, Kingsize. But at that time we actually had a Studio B and a Studio C, which were kind of being run as day to day. But it sounds crazy. It's like you're saying like 40 something rooms. Yeah, we have that many rooms, but most of them are month to month lockouts. Most of them are empty shell. Like we basically build the room, we treat it, we do bass trapping, we do clouds, we do all the stuff, and you bring your own. You rent it out. It's a monthly fee. We cover utilities, internet, the basic stuff. If you want to like get crazy fiber internet, that's up to you. But we provide the basics, and it's like I said, it's like a professional. It's like going to it's an audio office, like we have these buildings, like they're basically audio offices. So, like I was just over at our Verdugo location here in Los Angeles, and, we have the buildings becoming pretty much almost fully rented by composers. So it's and a lot of them know each other. So like it's becoming kind of like their kind of hub, and we have Atmos surround mixing, we got their assistants, we have the composers. But for us, it's just make it cool and make it nice and work with them, and like we're fixing up a floor now, because oh, the floor's getting a little janky, we got to like make it look a little better. So it's stuff like that. It's not the glamorous audio stuff on that side of the biz, I'm literally the landlord,
Yeah, well, that's what I was gonna say. Like, you're literally like a studio landlord, and like you've created this like there's lots of co-working spaces for people to rent for their own offices and their own small businesses, but like you've essentially done that in the studio world.
Yeah.
That's super cool. I love that.
Yeah.
Now I have to ask. I mean, like again, like going back to this idea of it being like, obviously you're not like outfitting 40 rooms with a Neve console or something like that. That would just be ridiculous. Yeah. But like you said, most of it is just like the design of the room and the treatment, and then people move in with their own gear. But even that, like there's still an element of if you build it, they will come. At least you're hoping for it. Like so when you were starting that, did you already have people that were like signed on to have these rooms, or was it literally like, okay, we're going to create this thing and like hope that we use it, otherwise it's just going to be a new vocal booth or something like that? Like, was there what did that look like in those early days?
Yeah, no, I mean, I noticed, like I said, I mean, as a studio owner, and Kingsize Studio A, which is the first studio I had here in LA. I was 10 years in Chicago before that, but it was mostly my own projects. And then I got married, I had kids, and then when my kids were getting into grammar school, we had to like kind of figure out like, how is dad going to see the kids? Because I would be at the studio for 6-7 days a week, like I was really hitting it hard then. I was doing like 12 to 16 hour days and like back-to-back albums. So I pretty much decided like I need to figure out some kind of residential situation for myself. And so that's when I bought the current house I'm in, and I've been here for 20 years now. I call the studio Chateau Trumfio. It's my personal studio, but it allowed me to spend, all like basically what I was seeing everybody else doing, where like they're going in and tracking for a week and a half, so maybe 2 weeks if it's a luxurious budget. But then the rest of they're going back to the room. They're going back to this kind of room, So I would just kind of chat with our clients, my friends, who were kind of in the same boat. And, and on the other side of other side is like, I kind of lucked out. I found this house basically it's a pool house with a studio was already built. So, I mean, I kind of really lucked out. I have to say I was blessed to find this place. But, from most of my friends and clients that I was chatting with, they're like, oh, yeah, well, I'm kind of in the third bedroom right now. Or, I'd much rather have a place to go to work from 9 to 5 than to like be where I work all the time. And to be honest, I've kind of hit many saturation points having my studio at home. Like I have to force myself like, oh, you guys want to work somewhere else? Yeah, let's do it. We got the budget. Like now I'm like, yeah, I'll spend the budget on that. Mental health for sure. But but no, I did notice the need for it, and that's why we built it. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
always a gamble. Like people say they want it, and then you do it, and they're like, "Well, I don't know. That's a little expensive." I mean, here's the thing: like we're doing this in Los Angeles, and the real estate here is off the charts. It's I don't know, Mike. Where are you located?
I'm just outside of Toronto, so
Okay.
yeah, it's pretty expensive around here too. But I think it's like I think LA is probably just expensive. Yeah,
But I mean, real estate in general is expensive, but like especially Los Angeles. So, most of our rooms, they're built for professionals. So that's been kind of a hurdle because like to expect somebody to pay, 2,000 to 2,500 a month for a room, which is kind of the zone. We have some more, we have a couple a little under, but that's kind of the average. You have to be working, you have to be making money doing this stuff. And so that's where, as the industry, and that's maybe the next 5 years, as the industry goes, where like, the monetization has been changing so much, and, it's kind of hard to make the money now, So, we've been noticing some of our steady clients like kind of going, well, I can't really afford to have the room anymore. So we're following that really closely, and, we're going to have to track, but the nuts and bolts of what it costs to own a property, the taxes, all that stuff, it kind of limits us where we can put our price point. So, that's just part of being a business person, but
for sure.
And it's, I never set out to be this person. I'm a musician. I'm a record producer. That's what I do. That's what I really love doing. But, as the kind of monetization and as the budgets, to be frankly, like what used to be, like where you could camp out for 6 weeks, like that's changed. It's changed. And I mean, It depends what kind of music you're working on too. I mean, I tend to work on more kind of like song-based, indie, alternative kind of, I'm into electronic, but the electronic stuff I'm into is kind of more weird left field electronic stuff like dark wave and stuff like that. So, it's not the music making billions of dollars and getting millions and millions and millions of streams, So, that's just part of the business. It's like the money side of it is like, you kind of that you just got to keep an eye on it as a business person. And, I think, like you said, most people, there's a statistic right now, like this is in this period of time, there's more music being released in one day on a release Friday than that was released the whole year of 1989 by all labels.
I've heard that. That's crazy.
So like, it's not like music isn't happening. Music's happening way more than it was happening. So how do we all adapt? How do we make it work? And I think it's exciting. I think it's a super exciting time. I think it's super exciting. And, like the whole kind of creator side of it too, like what you're doing with this channel, like that's just exciting to me. It just gets my head going on. Okay, well, what's the next thing? I mean, I know at Gold Diggers, we've been doing some podcasts, and we're talking with a couple, we've done stuff with Consequences Sound, and like basically like kind of adapting, kind of like, okay, well, people aren't coming in and recording like rock records, they're coming in doing vocals, or they're doing a couple days here, a couple days there. But, we, as business, we kind of opened up to other possibilities, like streaming and filming and all that kind of stuff. So, we're, 20, 30 years ago, if you're a recording studio, you're a recording studio. If you're a film studio, you're a film studio. Now like everything is kind of crossed, and now it's just content and media. We specialize in the audio part of it, obviously, but we kind of find ourselves doing everything.
That makes sense to me. And it's cool to hear you talk about that, because I've always kind of felt that way too, where like, yes, the big studios, I think that we're seeing fewer and fewer of them, but they do serve a purpose for the people that need that big sound and, want to have that experience of, having the best of the best in the biggest room and blah, blah, blah.
And I have a theory
I think
this
that
too.
will...
I have a theory.
Okay, go ahead. I'd love to hear it.
No, I'm sorry. I blocked you.
Okay. No, it's all good. I want to get back to that. But I agree with that. I think that like you're going to see fewer and fewer of those big studios, but they're going to survive kind of on legacy alone. And then I think that, kind of to what you said, there's a lot more people that are going to the home studio setup. I totally understand what you're talking about in terms of the need for an external home studio. As I'm saying this, I can hear my wife in the other room, like doing laundry, and like my dog's barking upstairs, whatever. And so I can totally understand that and why there's a need for that. But I also see that the writing is on the wall these days too, that the music industry as a whole has changed, where it's more of it is a content heavy industry. It's the entertainment industry. It's not music industry anymore. Yeah. And so I agree with you that like that is probably the next avenue for studios to venture into, is like having this kind of all-in-one content creation hub that has the audio, has the video, and stuff like that. I don't know, it's interesting, and I mean, obviously, you've thought about this a lot. Having I
think about studios, it every day. So. I mean, I kind of block my day off. Like in the morning, I kind of deal with business and stuff like that, and then around 1 o'clock, I shift into my creative work. So a lot of my mornings are filled with where things going, what's going on. I just talked to my partner at Gold Diggers this morning, and we have pretty cool shoots coming up, and we have great sessions. We have great sessions too. But yeah, I mean, regarding like the old school kind of classic studio, and obviously there's the legendary places, the Sunsets, the East Wests, United closed. Like they're still there, the studios are there, but they've pretty much shifted their whole model to just filming. Or like private lockouts, like, if, A-lister producer guy person wants to take out a studio for a year and pay a astronomical price, they'll do it, but as far as like the traditional recording studios, and I feel like, and this is kind of goes with the ebb and flow of the 5-year cycle, especially with the dawning of AI, especially now, you can pretty much make a perfect sounding production, like you can like just pipe it all in with AI and it sounds, you got the Nashville level, like, studio musician band, everything's perfect. Okay, great. You can do that now. It's so easy to do. You can create these stacked harmonies. You can do all this stuff, right? And it sounds perfect. Who cares? Perfect's boring. I think it's going to go. I think the next flow, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, say, I think people want to hear humans. I think they want to hear real performances. They don't want to hear, they don't want to hear perfect. They want to hear character. I mean, not everybody. I mean, I'm really into certain electronic music that it's, I'm a huge Kraftwerk fan, the Man Machine. So I love that. But there's a certain human thing even there, but like this whole kind of super polished everything, especially with a lot of like the kind of like like the plugins for resonance filters and making everything so smooth that it just washes over you. I think there's going to be a coming back to more live recording. I think, obviously the modern production where you can kind of piece everything together, like you can do drums there and then give it to your friend and they can do this, and you can kind of do these projects, which a lot of music nowadays is. I think there's going to be a coming back to, let's get into a room. Let's get into a room and let's mic it up. And whether that's in somebody's living room or like in their home studio, like your studio or my studio. I mean, I have an ISO booth over here that's like, I got a drum kit. It's bigger than an ISO booth. It's like a small tracking room, I guess. But I have it all set up so I could be in the room. And a lot of my sessions, a lot of my writing sessions I do now, rather than kind of just going through like a bunch of loops and stuff that are coming in with some beats and going, hey, I got this vibe. Like, what do you think? If everyone's players, I'm like, let's just go sit and play instruments. Let's mess around. Oh, you play drums, jump on the kit. I'll grab a bass and we'll kind of start developing something very organically rather than, in a vacuum on our laptops, So I think that is important to realize. I think music kind of goes in fads, and I feel like that whole kind of like laptop production mentality, I think it has a place and it will always be there, and it's great, and I do it all the time. But I think also getting humans in a room with microphones, I don't think that's going to go away. Yeah. I just like
I agree with that theory altogether.
Yeah, I just saw the premiere of the Los Lobos documentary, and classic example of, a band, like they're a very organic band, like they happen when they're together and playing together. So, it's obviously they're an older legacy band, but I feel like they're inspiring a lot of younger, like, Chicano Batman is a band here on the East Side that's kind of like the grandkids of Los Lobos, and they're so rad, and they're definitely a band, and they're still like, while there's all these like individual pop stars and electronic artists that are kind of doing stuff all kind of insular in their own world, I still think the idea of humans playing music is ultimately going to always be here, and it's not a contest. It's not like it's going to win, but it's not going to go away. And I think people will realize like there's a place for the proper tracking studio. And we have three tracking rooms right now, actually 4 tracking rooms that have proper consoles, microphones, live rooms, ISO booths, so, and they get booked, they do get booked. It's just not as much as it used to, now it's like, it's a little more piecemeal, like I said. Yeah. It's a little more like, oh, we're coming in to do drums, or, we need to cut guitars, and, even on that front, like I do it all the time. I use simulators all the time. I'm a bass player, so I love the Plug-in Alliance B15. Like it sounds really good, but there's times like when I need, when as a producer, or it's a stylistic call, like you want to get some amps, you want to get some air moving. And so we do a lot of that kind of sessions in the bigger rooms, like where like they need to crank up a half stack, like really crank it up, So there's less and less because the simulators are so good, but drums, for example, in tracking basic tracks together as humans, you need a proper studio for that in most cases.
For sure. But I find what you said there really empowering in a couple areas. One is that, number one, I think it's actually great that you mentioned that like things happen in cycles, because I think that gives people something to look out for and to like still pay attention to what's happened in the past and like use that to inform future decisions. And with your comment about AI, I think it's really empowering, because you're absolutely right. As things get more and more perfect and formulaic, and AI is spitting out like the same song structure and same tones and stuff like that, like I agree. I think we're going to run into a situation where people are going to be like, we need the next Nirvana. We need something that's just going to like throw us for a loop, and it's going to sound raw and different than everything else. And that is exactly where a home studio, I actually think, is going to be a great spot for it to grow. Like you're going to get these people who don't have all of that pristine high-end equipment and are going to make really cool, unique stuff with like budget gear. And then that's going to help to spawn the next thing. So it does, you can see that cycle starting to happen. And then I think probably from there, you're going to get enough of that like new, whatever we want to call it, like that new rough grungy sound or whatever. Yeah. And then that's probably going to turn into someone being like, what if we like have a nicer studio? And then you get like a nicer drum sound or something like that. And then maybe we'll start to get into that clean era again, big studio sound. But it's probably going to happen like that, where it's like a big cyclical thing. But I do think it's really an empowering thing to know that like we can, I do think that the future of music is going to be home studio based and like human sounding. And that's,
yeah, as far as
you don't need to have the big room.
Yeah, I mean, where I've come, where my roots are, I'm total punk rock DIY. That's what I am. Yeah. That's what I've grown up doing, and the whole DIY side of creating music and kind of doing, I think it's super important that that people use, now that everybody kind of has the technology on their side and they can use it. It's a tool. It's an instrument. I use the studio as an instrument. I've always used it as an instrument. And I think, if you're serious about it, you need to have your instrument. You need, whether you're like doing like you're playing ukulele and you're recording on your phone, well, maybe you get a little nicer mic for your phone and, you kind of hone in, but it's all tools, right? And yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important. And my kids, for example, they just by osmosis grew up with like Mackeys and like Logic in their rooms, and I think the younger generation now, like it's just become kind of like part of the fabric, most people grew up with a pretty decent computer with GarageBand on it, and like the ability to kind of get in there and to start making beats and figuring out this stuff like on a very organic level, And I think it's so important that people keep that tradition, the whole idea of, the whole program's called GarageBand. Because there used to be people that get in the garage and just play, and like that still happens. There's still garage bands, So I just think it's super. It's just now the garage band can actually have some equipment to record them very easily, and actually, if somebody in the band is like myself or yourself, like they can go, I'm the guy or person that's gonna like mix the song and we can put it up on SoundCloud or, whatever, SoundCloud was huge, 10, 15 years ago. And it was like, you didn't have to put it on a DSP. You can just be a SoundCloud artist, So, the technology's there now. And then now you're throwing in like content and cameras. And as a creative person right now, it's the golden age. It's the golden age, I feel.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, all of the stuff that we're talking about here, I do still think that like the content studio is still going to be very important, but the home studio side of things is going to be just as important for like the garage band that wants to get started and have their unique sound.
It's the new garage.
That there's going to be a connection where like the garage band still does need to pay attention to the content side of things and maybe partner up with people in those kind of studios, but it's going to be the next wave of what we have as we know. In the entertainment industry as we know it, I think it's really cool.
There's a place for it all.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I am curious to ask, like, I know that at Kingsize, you guys had a Neve 8068 for many years. And for the audience, if you're not familiar with that, it's, a very highly sought after console. And I know you got rid of that recently and swapped it out with an SSL Origin, which for some people, that would be a pretty big decision. Like going from like a really classic, well-known sought after board to something a little bit newer. It's still an SSL, but it's a newer thing. So I'm curious to know, like, what inspired you to make that switch? Was that part of like kind of what we're talking about here of this idea of, kind of changing up the gear and all that kind of stuff?
First off, I think owning the Neve 8068, I had it for a little over 20 years. That was my dream console, and I think it's most people's dream console. It's legendary. And as a working studio, to keep a console that's pushing 50 years old, it's just a lot of money in upkeep. That console, so Kingsize Studio A, we use, it's mostly a tracking studio. So the front end on that console, hands down, is, considered to be one of the best, if not the best. So the 31102s, we had mostly 31102 modules, which are the preamp EQs, pretty much 1084s, Neves, if we're talking Neve here. And we had some 1073s. It pretty much got used as a table to hold those preamps, to be honest. We weren't, it was never like the AUX modules, the people weren't running headphone mixes. Nowadays in the modern, it's just, I'm a realist. Like the workflow is just what it's not 1975. I know a lot of people want to live I think a lot of younger people especially want to record the tape and live like it's 1995. And, that's great. And I love doing those projects when somebody says, hey, let's cut the tape. And we have a brand new JH24 Mara 24 track that we had, that's a restored 24 track. It's like a brand new machine. So when somebody wants to come in with the Neve, if we wanted to run the Pro Tools, the 24 track, it's like a body. Like if you just sit in a chair and just eat, your mouth works, but the rest of your body is going to die, right? So with the Neve, like it just wasn't getting used that way on a day-to-day. Like people weren't coming in and mixing. It didn't have flying faders, so really it just kind of came down to like, it looked really cool and people were really impressed by it. And I loved owning it. And we would stem out every so often and like do a mix through it and stuff. But more and more people were just like not using the console the way it was meant to be used, So, and frankly, it came down to a business decision on, we were pouring in close to 75 to 10 grand a year just on tech, just on fixing the modules, And it got to a point where it needed full reswitching. The whole console needed a full reswitching. We already recapped it twice since owning it. We gave it what's called a sonic bath a couple times where you dip the modules and, But really at the end of the day, the switches, which there's hundreds of switches on that console, they were all getting to the end of their life. And they don't make the switches anymore. And there's a few people hoarding them and just even, finding them and securing them, buying them would be very, very expensive. And to actually reswitch the console, it can be done, but every switch needs to be changed basically to another mechanism. It needs to be retrofitted. And at that point, it's not original vintage or whatever, and there's going to be people poo-pooing that, I'm sure. But, we could get it back working 100%. It was going to be about $100,000 to do that. Yeah. So as a business person, as much as I love seeing that console in my room, we're not an audio museum. This is something I like to say. We're not an audio museum. We're a real studio, and people are coming in and they want stuff to work. And if they want to run headphones from the console, it needs to work. If they want to record 24-track analog and bring it up on the console and run headphones from there, it all needs to work, So that's where I started looking for a new console. And the origin kind of came to my attention through Jeff Ehrenberg, who is a longtime friend and my broker, who's kind of helped me he helped me buy the original Neve and whatnot. He has a company called Providence Sound and Vision. Anyways, he was like, I was talking about the Rupert Neve, getting a brand new Rupert Neve design. I already did Gold Diggers. We have we actually took delivery on the first API 2448 at the end of 2018. And we actually helped announce that at AES, that console, which is an amazing console. APA. Cool. But, I never had an SSL, although I worked on SSLs. I'd go to plenty SSL studios in the 80s and 90s, especially in the 90s. And then, once my workflow kind of went to more of a hybrid in the box tracking on a console and then staying in there, I became to love SSL EQs, the plugins, I use them all the time. So it's as a Sculpey EQ, as a Swiss Army knife, I'm like, oh man, I actually do like SSL EQs. And, I was never, although they're nice and they're clean, the preamps are good. And I tracked on them before, but the new Origins, they have what's called a peer drive mic pre, which you can run very linear in one mode, like a duality or a very clean hi-fi, but you can push the button down and you can get a nice kind of harmonic distortion, it gives it that kind of cool low mid schmear kind of thing that the API Neve does. So it's very usable. I've tracked drums on the Origin and I'm like, whoa, this is really good. I'm not missing my sidecars. With that said, I have sidecars. With that, I'm so used to the Neves. I love the Neves. And I use those pre's all the time. So we literally have 20 channels of Neve pre's. We have a whole sidecar of 1084s, 1073s. So, if you want that front end, that we were using this 8068. And here's another thing about the 8068, especially in modern music. The two-bus, the monitor section on that console, it sounds amazing. It has a sound. It's coloring the sound, So we ended up probably about 10, 12 years ago switching to a Grace monitor controller that we bypassed the monitor section on the Neve, because most modern pop, more modern music, people want that super transparent monitoring. They want to know, okay, if it sounds this way, they want to know they're adding that into their sound, not that that's actually coloring the sound. And, what became apparent was people would be in the control room and they're like, man, this sounds amazing. Let's bounce it out and go out to the car. They weren't hearing the monitor section. They weren't hearing the transformers and stuff that, is going to color the Neve sound of the monitor section. So they're like, wow, we're making decisions based on what we're hearing in the room, but it isn't what gets bounced out. Right. So we had enough people go, hey, yeah, it's cool, but it's not really translating the way we thought it would. So we got the grace, boom, done. Sounds great.
Interesting.
So
Very interesting.
That's where people like hold this vintage stuff, and I'm old enough to have grown up on tape. I'm old enough to have grown up using consoles in old school way. I'm not romantic about it anymore. I never was romantic about it, to be honest. Like once Pro Tools came out, and once it got to 24-bit, and you can the converter started sounding good, like late 90s. I wasn't looking back. But I do love a good front end, but in a modern way, we have APIs. We have an API sidecar. Actually, they're Cappy, the Wally Heider 312.
I love the Cappy stuff. It's great.
Yeah. And we have 550 API EQs, like some vintage, some newer ones. We still have some 515s and 312s as well in over there. So it's kind of a hybrid between classic API and Cappy. And then we have our Neve sidecar, and then we have the Origin. And the Origin, now the reason we ended up going with the Origin, it's two reasons. And as much as I love Rupert Neve and API, and I know those guys, and I love those guys, and I love their consoles. My wife, who books the studio, said, because we were looking at a custom console as well, and she's like, "Well, nobody's going to know about that custom console." She goes, "It needs to be API, SSL, or Neve." She just gave me an ultimatum. She's like, "Nope, you can't. It cannot be anything else."
That is the wife that you want, who knows that you need one of those three consoles.
Well, she gets the calls, and she's like, people are like, "What's the board?" Yeah, she knows exactly. And she's a musician. She grew up like playing in bands and stuff. So we're like two peas in a pod there, But yeah, so she basically gave me the ultimatum, and then it came down to I sat with Jeff, and I kind of did the pluses and minuses. And the Origin, just the routing as a centerpiece for a modern hybrid studio, it gave more than the other consoles were giving, and at like a price point that was half the price, if not closer to a quarter of the price. I was pricing out consoles that were kind of getting up into like the 180, 190 range. I think we bought the Origin. I know there's been a price jump since we bought it, but I think a little under $50K. I think we paid $48,000 for it, which, is a lot of money for a recording console. Most people are like, "Oh my God." But, like the Neve, for example, it sold for, way, way more than that. So, it's, the Neve was and they sell, like they're selling in like the 300s, the 500s on up, they're houses.
This is wild. Yeah. They are fancy Ferraris that need a ton of maintenance every year.
Absolutely. And then they got to a point like with the maintenance on them. Exactly. We do a session. It'd be like taking out the Ferrari for a weekend, and Monday came around and you needed the tech to come in, and techs aren't cheap, and there's less and less people who can, fix that equipment as well. So I think as a business, we decided to go more blue collar audio and be like, we need it to work. People need to come in here and they're paying money to come into the studio. We charge really affordable rates compared to other studios, but it's still money. People want to, they don't want to go and turn a knob and have it all like cutting in and out and stuff like that, which would happen on the Neve,
For sure. Yeah. Well, you kind of also hinted at this a little bit earlier. In addition to switching out the Neve, I know you've also talked about getting rid of some more esoteric pieces of gear in favor of more of like the kind of like, I think you called it like the greatest hits gear. Yeah. Like the stuff that everyone knows, the distressors and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm curious to know, like, it sounds like this was all part of this studio shift of thinking about the future of the studio and how to keep people in the door. That's what I thought. And then, some people would say that like, people buy gear because it has a specific sound. It allows you to have a certain sound. And much like many people would say they want the Neve because it gives you that specific sound. But now that you've gotten rid of a lot of these boutique pieces, I'm curious to know, like, has it changed your perspective on buying gear or how you get the most out of the gear, like, in terms of being able to get quality results, but without necessarily needing a specific piece of gear.
Everything's so subjective, I think where I kind of decided a lot of the pieces that I ended up kind of swapping out were pieces that I personally bought in the early 2000s when I was using the room as my room. I was doing all my records in there. And then around 2005, we started transitioning into letting, that's when I got my home studio going here, and I was spending less time there, and we were renting it out more on a commercial level, whether it was to friends or, we've always our marketing's always been kind of word of mouth, but we kind of let it known like, hey, like you can book the studio now. So as we started doing that and more kind of third-party engineers and producers were coming into the room, a lot of them weren't familiar with some of the stuff I had. And I just noticed, our assistant engineers who would be running the sessions, and I'd kind of be like, hey, what's going on? Like, everything go good, And one piece was the inward connections. I had a bunch of inward connections gear, and I love that gear. But it's definitely a boutique, esoteric pieces of gear, and people were not using it. They'd come in and they're whether they're just under pressure and they need to get results that they know, they're going to use an LA2A, they're going to use an 1176, they're going to use a distressor, they're going to use the things they know, right? While,
stuff they probably have plug-in versions of.
Exactly. But that's another thing is people are like, oh, I know that. Exactly. Inward connections, I don't even know if they have plugins of that stuff. So although like the preamp and the EQs, I had a rack of them, two of them, they're killer. It was like, it's the coolest, gooeyest, coolest tube preamp with a really great pull tech right next to it. But, they would go for the Tube Tech Pool Tech EQs that I had over the inwards just because, oh, that's blue and it looks exactly like the plugin or whatever, or what they know. I mean, old seasoned engineers, they'd be like, no, I know that. Like, I know, I don't, like, I'm on their dime. I don't want to experiment right now. So that's where, running a commercial facility versus a private facility, you got to kind of think more on like, what do people need and what are they expecting, As much as I want like an engineer with a client to come in and mess around with, A, B, or C esoteric outboard gear, like I can sit there as the owner and be like, oh man, you're going to want to use that, weird tube mixer over there that you'd never seen or heard, but that thing sounds amazing. And like, people are like, nah, I'm going to use the Neve, It's like I'm going to use the SSL. I'm going to use the API. Going back to Ron and my wife, which she's like, no, this needs to be like what people want. So at my home studio, I still have goofy stuff, and I have I love weird gear. I love the broken guitar pedal that does one thing, that I can't really have in the studio because people are going to go, oh, this is broken. Yeah, but if you run a drum machine through it, or you run a mic, through it for like a crotch mic on a kit, like it sounds fucking amazing, no, people don't want to experiment like that when they're paying money to be in a room, So that was the big thing with that whole thing, and it was absolutely an ebb and flow. Like, I'm like, okay, how do we future proof? I mean, a big thing for me is future proofing right now, and we're kind of predicting where things are going. And that was a big part of future proofing. It's like, okay, I love this gear, but this gear is worth way too much money to be sitting unused. Let's move that into buying some more classics. Now, one company that is really doing great reproductions is Audioscape. And they're doing the 1176. They're doing all the greatest hits. And that's a fantastic company. I can't say more good things about them, So, we kind of like, we kind of moved away from stuff that, people didn't know as much to like, oh, you know what that is. That's a 33609, or that's a, that's a stay level kind of compressor, So yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's like it's an efficiency thing, I think.
Yeah.
We're moving into that kind of era where it's like people just want to make music fast and they don't have time for creativity. They don't have time to figure out this new piece of gear that maybe works like an LA2A, but it looks different. They don't understand how to use it, or it tricks their brain. So so there's that element of like familiarity makes people move fast, and it almost kind of negates the difference in quality, because it might be a slight difference, and who cares at that point if you're able to at least get the session moving.
Yeah, honestly, like after years of doing this, now I can say I've been doing this for many, many years. It doesn't matter. Like what it's like the subtleties between this and that. At the end of the day, like you're going to tweak that so much in the mix. You're going to like, oh man, that thing just gives like a really cool girth to this thing. By the time you get that in a mix, you're going to carve that girth out. I mean, this is the way. There's only so much you can put in the water balloon, right? Now, if you're just doing like a solo guitar with like a kick drum and a vocal and maybe one other element, yeah, you can make that kick drum through that tube pre like sound like 10,000 acre kick drum, and you can get your stuff. But like once, like I find that a lot with vintage synths as well. Like I'm a big synth guy, and like old vintage, like Roland's and Yamaha CS synths, like these like super fat, like they just have this woolly goodness. But if once you get it into like a dense pop production, you're gonna thin that out just to make it sit in the mix the right way. So I find like a lot of this debate and a lot of this and that, it doesn't matter. I hate to say it because I've made my living off selling recording studios that have all this really awesome gear. It does matter though. Front end does matter, but the difference between a reissue 1176 or LA2A versus the vintage one versus whether you're going to use the inward connection versus you're going to use the audioscape. I mean, it's important that you're putting those circuits and getting that harmonic content. That's super important. I don't want to negate that. But the subtleties between them doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's not worth like the tens of thousands of dollars of extra price, and thinking about how many projects you have to do to pay that off and all that kind of stuff too.
I have a rule. Like when we did this, when we did the redo, I have a rule. If it has a badge that's worth thousands of dollars more than the unit's worth, let's sell it.
Fair.
I sold some original Uris. I'm like, you know what? I have a hairball that sounds really good. It will do fair. What I needed to do. And some of those pieces, like some of them are magic. I'm not going to say that they aren't, but that one little magic thing that they do for one thing, it's not worth not selling it for $8,000.
It's a hard thing to justify.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. So do you feel like, I mean, we've talked about this, we've talked about this concept with the idea of analog gear so much today, but like, do you feel like you take the same approach to plugins as well? Like, are you kind of just like a minimal plugin, greatest hits kind of guy there as well?
That's like right now, I'm kind of going plugin wild.
Okay.
But I mean, I've been using these plugins since the 90s. So like, it's funny you say like, oh, like it looks like an LA2A, but does it sound like an LA2A? In the case of like Bomb Factory and the early, like, Waves and the early Avid plugins, like I was just doing a project yesterday. I have to deliver some stuff to London, and the person I'm working with has very minimal plugins. They only have like the Avid stuff and some basic stuff. So I kind of did all my stuff and my session. I committed, and then like I had to do like a rough mix and do my 2-bus. So like I started looking at like the Avid stuff that's been in there and pretty much the same plugins since the 90s. And I used to use them all the time. But man, they don't sound, I mean, they have their own sound. And it just reminded me, even like the Pultec, like on my 2-bus, I use like, the 7-band, and then I put the Pultec kind of after, to kind of like do like a mastering bus chain and to do the Pultec thing. And it does a thing. It's not Pultec. So, but where plugins have gotten are insane. insane. Like the replicas of like Pultex, like UA and the different companies that are doing, I think they sound amazing, and I love the tape plugins. I mean, they sound great and you can tweak them. I'm really, really into this company called Pulsar Modular, and they did like an API 2-bus section. That thing's amazing. And then the Stevens tape machine. I mean, it does so much. It gives it so much sound that you have to put it on early. Like you cannot like just be almost done with the mix and go, oh, let me put this on there. You're going to want to remix because you pushing into that thing, it just feels so real to me. It feels like you're pushing into a console. So I think plugins have really gotten to a point where they're amazing. And to be honest, I'm really kind of going off into it, at least with my personal studio. I couldn't do this in Kingsize or commercial studio. I think the UA mics are really cool. I think they're really, cool. Really cool. I think, on my personal stuff, I'm using them. The kick drum mic, yep. I think it's what is it? The 5?
The Sphere?
I think it's Sphere. Yeah. I mean, perfectly in aligned phase. I can put a D12. I can put, a 52. I can do, you have one instance, like on a guitar cab, you have one instance and then you can like put all these different mics perfectly in phase and use them almost like as EQs, and, I'm not romantic, like I said, because like, it's what happens at the end. What I'm hearing through the speakers sounds really good. And people can poo-poo it all they want. It doesn't matter. Yeah, I own the real mics. Yeah, I can go and I can bring them over to my house and use them. But, I leave them over at the studio for people to use them in that setting, right? I'm not against the new technology, especially with the digital, the plugins and the modeling. I think the modeling is really great. I got to meet Kemper the other day, and he was like, so ahead on that curve, and
oh yeah,
my son's actually working on his band right now, and actually got a record deal, which is really cool. And very cool. It's small, but they got a deal, and my son plays a Mesa dual rectifier, and when he plays live, but in the studio he's pretty much using simulators. It's like yeah. we mic'd them up, and yeah, maybe like 30% of the guitars on the recording are amps, but the rest are simulators. They just sound really good. I mean, at the end of the day, what do you hear coming through the speakers? Yeah, man, that sounds
Nobody
amazing.
Knows, and who cares?
Nobody knows or cares. Exactly. Yeah, and I just feel like it's funny because we're on this pro audio talk here, and like I think we're in a day and age now that all that's water under the bridge. I mean, there's a time and place for it all, like I love using real mics and weird mixers and stuff. For sure. If I have time to experiment, but at this other time is like, okay, I got from 1 to 5 today to do this. I know how to get the result. I know what can do it. Yep. And whether it's a plugin or a simulator or what, I'm going to use it. It's a tool. At the end of the day, it's a tool.
Yep, absolutely. Well, to kind of like sum it all up, like you mentioned the term future proofing as like, that's what you're always focused on. And, we've talked about kind of where you see the big studio market, the home studios as well. But when it comes to like future-proofing your studio, someone who's maybe looking to get into starting their own studio business now, and like thinking about like what to do, like where should they be putting their energy to future-proof it?
First and foremost, make it your own thing. Make sure you're creating your own vibe and creating your own environment. Don't worry too much about replicating other stuff, because I think at the end of the day, this is a personality, and if your goal is to work with clients and develop clients and like, develop that side of what you do, being an individual, being, just creating that environment that's like says this is my instrument and come and hang out and be with me in my instrument. I think that's really important. I think a lot of people miss that, and a lot of people see Mix magazines from like the 80s or whatever, and like they're like, oh, that's what a studio's supposed to look like. I've seen some really awesome creative spaces in the last 10 years of people who have like just made stuff their own vibe and stuff like that. As far as gear goes, I think what's really important is front end. And whether that's investing in good mic pre's and, like I said, microphones, I think from a beginning standpoint, I really can stand behind stuff like the UA Sphere system. If you need to kind of get in and get something good going right away, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer if I was starting over again. That's not to say I'm not going to want my cool Heiserman 47 or my Upton 251s or, a real Coles or, a real Beyer 160, but
something you work your way into.
Yeah, work your way into. And, to be honest, especially with vintage stuff, they're not all the same. I've shot out like a brand new Heiserman 47, which I think are amazing. That Eric Heiserman's company he's just making some great boutique microphones right now that will give any vintage 47 a run for the money. And I've actually shot them out, and I've done the shootout, and I know Blackbird did one. I don't know if people are talking about it much, but they shot it out and it won a blind blind listening test, So I think there's a lot of really great affordable stuff, but vintage stuff isn't necessarily better. Some of it's great. You can find the holy grail. You can find the one that does that one thing. But I find a lot of vintage stuff is hit or miss. I feel like, okay, if it's a vintage U47, is it a good sounding vintage U47? I've heard vintage U47s that sound like there's a wet blanket thrown over it, and it's like, oh, well, that's part of the sound. Like, you have to use the 10K on the 1073 to bring back the life. And that's part of the magic. And I'm like, no, that's not part of the magic.
Then you need that whole chain of all that expensive gear. Yeah.
It's like, and then you put the pull tech on it. You do this. And like, nah, I kind of like it to sound good when it just comes in. And then I can kind of like do that if I need to do a little of that. I'm not a purist that way. I mean, not early, but like in the late 90s, I worked with Joe Ciccarelli, who is a legendary engineer producer. And so I kind of called it my master class. So we worked on a record together, and he would just do whatever it took, like a kick drum. I mean, I think at one point he had, like 3 mics on it going through like 2, 560 EQs, APIs through like a pull tech through this. And it was just this crazy chain, like breaking all the rules of like purity and like preamp, mic placement, he was just going for it. And that's something I really learned from that experience. Like there's no rules. Yeah, you breaking rules.
And the next song, he probably just put up like a 57 in front of like whatever,
I think it depends. I think we were just going for a certain thing, and we wanted it to have a sound, and sometimes you just got to do it, Yeah. So I think like if you're just starting out and you need to focus, I think monitoring is really important. I think making sure your room sounds good. I know it's kind of cliche at this point with all the YouTube people saying this stuff, but it's important. Like, you can have a room, and if you're not hearing what you're supposed to be hearing, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle, So stuff like that. I mean, there's some really, really good affordable monitors. Like actually those MTMs right there on my bridge, those things are incredible for the money. Incredible. I'm not sponsored by them, although I would appreciate it if they would send me something sometime. But I've had a love-hate thing with monitors over the years, and I think I finally found my monitors. And I have these KSDs here, and these things are amazing, and they go super low, like down to 30 hertz without a sub. They're not cheap. They're around $5,000 a pair in that zone. The MTMs, you can get those for I think under $1,000. So, like getting some good monitors, like getting, I mean, there's some great ones out there. I mean, I've been a huge Atom user over the years, I know Cali makes some really good stuff now. I mean, there's stuff like under $1,000 that a beginner can kind of like get that I think blow away like standards from the 90s even, So
Sure.
I think we're living in, that's another thing. We're living in a day and age where it's a golden age of gear. It's really, you can get really affordable. Like I said, the Audioscape stuff is just giving any of the classics a run for the money as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. So it's just ease into it. I think having good preamps is important. I think although, I mean, I do think, like I said, I like the UA, I like the modeling. If you really want to get granular, like, people are going to say, oh, well, the UA is good, but, the conversion isn't as good as a Lynx or isn't as good as this or that. Yeah, I mean, you'll get there in your career. If you really want to go down the rabbit hole, like, let's start talking clocking, and external clocks.
Yeah.
I've been through that. Like, that was my early 2000s. But, I'm about to go to a Lynx after years of being, just because I was more in songwriting mode and I was using like the workflow of the UA, and I was using Ableton a lot more and Logic, but like of recent years, Pro Tools got Sketch, which allows you to do kind of an Ableton kind of, grid mode, which to me is like a really important to my workflow. So I recently made a decision to go to 100% back into a HDX Pro Tools and a Lynx converter, because I'm doing a lot more mastering and mixing these days, and I have a couple big projects coming up that I have to like get back into that zone on. Although with that said, I've done plenty of stuff with the UA and a dangerous 2-bus monitor controller, and it sounds great.
Yeah.
Get a good set of headphones. These are the Neumanns, the 30s, which I just kind of started using because I really want to use their immersive technology to do some Atmos, kind of like getting stuff ready for Atmos. And so I'm kind of forcing myself to learn these right now. But, I was a buyer guy for years and years and years, and recently went over to Audie's, the Manny Marroquin 500 model, which isn't their most expensive. It's actually priced pretty reasonable for what they are. I think, knowing some good headphones is valuable. You need to do that,
Yeah, for sure.
And the Manny Marroquins are like, they make you work. They're not fun.
Yeah.
They're not fun headphones, but if you get in there and you work and you make them sound good, they translate really good. So that's what you need. You need to learn stuff like that and have your tools, to rely on as moving forward. Especially if your goal is to be a professional and be consistent.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the big takeaway from it is just like start small. Like you've mentioned a lot of really high end gear in this episode that you own, but you've worked your way up to that point now. So like you've got the business for it. You've figured out your business model with the other studios that could probably supplement some of this gear addiction and all that, whatever But it's all, you've worked your way up to that point now. And for anyone who's getting started, the technology is there. You can start really cheap and still get great gear. Yeah, I just think with everything you talked about earlier, as far as like the future of the industry and home studios becoming a really important part of that. Yeah, I think it's just really empowering for everyone listening to this. So, yeah, David, this has been awesome, man. I've really enjoyed learning like your approach to all of this. If people want to learn more about you, maybe even work with you, check out your studios, what's the best way for them to do that?
Probably the best way. I mean, I'm on social media. I'm a Dat68 on Instagram and Dave Trumfio on Facebook. I still use Facebook a lot. We also have KingsizeSoundlabs.com is our website, and there's a whole way you can get in touch with me through there too. Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's funny, I started off with like a cassette deck and then an X15, and there's those equivalents are now. And the iPad, I just got a new iPad recently, and I can't believe where they've gone with the iPad even. You can do some
crazy how much power you have in there. Yeah. Compared to the 4-track, it's insane now. You can have a full blown multi-track DAW on an iPad compared to like your
most
4-track.
Most importantly, at the end of the day, make good music. Make music you like and be authentic. I think that's the most important.
Love it. I think that's a perfect spot to wrap up, man. So thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Mike.
So that was my interview with Dave Trumfio, and I thought he did a great job of detailing the state of running a studio business in 2026 and, understanding the business of how to survive in this market and, how to run a profitable studio. And there are a few things that he said that really stuck with me and that I think are worth reiterating here. The very first one really being that there's this concept of these 5 to 7 year cycles that happen in the industry. It was something that I was always aware of as far as like musical trends goes, like something that was popular 5 years ago, 7 years ago, that typically comes back around and becomes the next popular thing, or an evolution of that becomes a popular thing. But it is also important to look at these trends from a business perspective as well. And you can definitely see them. So if you're paying attention to them, it allows you to know what's coming up and allow to prepare for those kind of things moving forward. So that's the first thing I think it's really important to pay attention to. The second point is all about not getting caught up in the gear traps. And, Dave talked a lot about some really high-end gear that he has, Neve boards, SSL boards, that kind of stuff. He didn't start there. He started very small and he worked his way up eventually. So, when you're running a successful business, you have more money, you can afford those higher end pieces of gear. But I do think that it's also important to note that, he's downsizing a lot of this stuff because it's allowing him to run his business more efficiently. And you can't just get into this massive rabbit hole of always needing the next big piece of gear that you don't have, right? Like, it's a very dangerous trap. Like, we're in this to make money, right? If you want to own a studio, you need to profit. You can't just have a cool space of gear and hope that people show up and that you can stay afloat. Like, that doesn't happen. It's expensive to own a professional studio. So I love that he talked about that idea of really focusing on like the greatest hits. And I think that still applies. I know Dave said that he's in this stage right now where he's buying a lot of plugins. I think in many ways, like, a lot of people go through that same process of owning a lot of plugins and like having an obsession with plugins and collecting them, to realizing like, you now have spent a ton of money on plugins and you realize like, oh, wait a minute, there's only like 10 plugins I actually use. And then you start to get down to that greatest hits kind of plugin library, like Dave was talking about with analog gear. So, focusing on what's the smartest business play here? What do I actually need to get people in the door and to do a good job? That is the most important thing to focus on there. And then lastly, I thought it was really cool to hear him talk about AI and how that's impacting the future of music, but also impacting the state of studios. And I thought it was really great to hear him talk about how home studios are really going to be positioned to kind of be the breeding point of so much good music that's going to come out in the future. And how, this quest for perfection, we're not going to want that. And I think that actually makes it a lot easier for people because you don't have to have a ton of great gear and you don't have to constantly be chasing perfection. You could really get started right away with like very minimal setups. And as long as you're making unique creative music, I think that's going to be something that is going to stand out in the future. Like, yeah, right now things are sounding very perfect. And it does help to know that side of things and to know how to make really pristine, perfect sounding records. But ultimately, making music that just sounds good, that moves people, and that is exciting, that is what people ultimately need to focus on. And that's what's going to help you have a successful career in the future. So I truly believe in Dave's predictions there. I think he did a great job of predicting all of that. So hopefully that gave you some things to think about as it relates to your own setup and your own studio. And to go back to Dave's point about the gear, there are a lot of engineers I know who have amazing gear, who have huge studios that have cost, I literally know people that have spent like millions of dollars on studios. And even people working in some of those environments are not getting great results. And so the gear itself isn't the thing that makes your production sound great. What it really comes down to is having your systems, knowing how to utilize what you have at your disposal, and how to have that decision-making process that ultimately allows you to get sounds that you hear in your head to come out of your speakers. And you can do that with very minimal gear. And so rather than focusing on new gear and more plugins, doing more in your mixes and all that stuff, I really want to encourage you to focus on those systems and that decision-making process, because that is super important. And that's exactly what I work on with my students inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. And in that program, like, we're figuring out where are the gaps in your current process? What sounds do you want to hear? And how do we get you there? And we walk you through the entire recording, editing, mixing stages. And step by step, we go through that together. I'm in your corner, giving you feedback, giving you guidance, giving you the process in a repeatable fashion so that you can get your music done. You can feel proud of the results. You can build your portfolio. You can get clients. And you can ultimately just feel like you're getting the most out of your studio. Now, if that sounds interesting to you, if you would love that one-on-one help, having someone in your back pocket, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com/amplitude. And on that page, you can learn more about the program. But I'm currently offering free production clarity calls. And on these calls, we're going to be talking about your goals, your process, what's working for you, what's not working for you, what you want your music to sound like, where you're feeling stuck. And the whole point of this call is to help you identify the gaps in your process and give you a sense of direction so that you know what you need to do in order to see the next wins and to actually make progress with your skills and feel like you're moving past a plateau and actually getting the results that you want. And if it seems like I can help you beyond that call, we can talk about the Amplitude coaching program and what that would look like to work with each other. But if I can't help you, or you just don't want to join the program, no problem. You're going to be able to, again, take everything we talk about and run with it on your own. Now, once again, if you're interested in learning more about that, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com/amplitude. These are free calls. So on that page, there's a link where you can book it. Let's hop on a call, and I'd love to learn more about how I can help you out. Now, with that said, we have reached the end of episode 300. Thank you so much again for listening to this episode and previous episodes, and I look forward to another 300 episodes and beyond. Thank you again. We'll talk soon. Have a good one. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit MasterYourMix.com.